Hi everybody, welcome back. Glad you could tune in again. So Monday saw the launch of our 2-year course in John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, our Introduction to Christian Theology course, as part of the All Saints Bible and Theology programme for young people. We're going to be working over a course of 2 years through this monstrous 1400-page behemoth, and we began on Monday with just 5 pages of it, which might not sound like much, but was quite enough to be going on with at this early stage. Over the course of the 25 years or so that Calvin was writing the Institutes, he published a number of prefaces and introductions and this kind of thing, and we looked at 2 of them. In particular, we looked at one letter that was written to the reader and appended to the beginning of the final 1559 version of the Institutes when it was published in Latin. And in it, John Calvin explains the purpose of that edition of the Institutes and the people to whom it was directed. It was quite instructive. I thought you might be interested in hearing it. He says, "It has been my purpose in this labour to prepare and instruct candidates in sacred theology for the reading of the divine word." Candidates in sacred theology, in other words, people in the seminaries, at the universities, trainee ministers, ministerial candidates, ordination candidates, men who are studying theology as part of a vocation. In other words, professional theologians of one sort or another. The institutes are to instruct them and to prepare them, he says, for the reading of the divine word. That's an interesting way of putting it. It's not, in other words, that you've read the Bible and you've really got to grips with it, and then you come to the Institutes as the kind of climax of your theological study. No, of course you've read the Bible a few times or a few dozen times, but really before you can get into it with any degree of seriousness, Calvin would say, this is to prepare you for the reading of the divine word so that you can advance in it, quote unquote, without stumbling. In other words, Calvin anticipates that this is a 1400-page introduction to the Bible. The sort of thing that a man would begin to read as he started at the seminary so that he could understand the scriptures better. More than that, Calvin anticipates, and he explains just a couple of sentences later, that at some point in the future he will be publishing lots of commentaries, as indeed he did, and when he publishes those commentaries, they stretch, by the way, if you lay them end to end, side by side, they go from about here to over there somewhere. Quite lengthy series of commentaries on most of the books of the Bible, and when he publishes those, he doesn't want to go off into long doctrinal digressions and excursions. He wants rather to condense all the doctrinal material in one place so that the biblical exposition can then flow, so that people can then read the Institutes as the source of the sort of doctrinal stuff and then get the biblical studies from his commentaries. So just pause there a second and realise what he's anticipating a course of theological study would look like for a seminarian or a ministerial candidate. You'd begin by reading the Institutes, having already studied the Bible on your own at some length. And then as you did so, you would start working your way through Calvin's tens of thousands of pages of commentary stretching halfway across the room. And every time you came across a theological issue that you didn't really understand, you'd come back to the Institutes. And by the time you finish that, then you have got some grounding in Christian theology. In other words, the Institutes is not a specialist theological manual. It's a generalist theological manual. If you want the really advanced stuff, Calvin would say, you've got to go elsewhere, go to his treatises and other places. But this is the introduction for seminary students. Of course, at that point, students at All Saints might have been tempted to breathe a huge sigh of relief and smile, and hasn't Calvin let them off the hook? Maybe they don't need to read these 1400 pages after all. Of course, they'd really like to, that's why they're there. But Calvin explains on the very next page that that's actually not the case. There was a second reason why he wrote the Institutes. It's not just for the theological specialists, for the ministers, for the doctoral candidates, and so on. He wrote a French edition, which was published the following year, and in it he explains why he published the French edition alongside the Latin. First of all, he says, I put it into Latin so as to serve all men of learning to whatever nation they belonged. Latin was the lingua franca of the 16th century, and so if you wanted to publish something for international use, every learned individual will be able to read Latin, of course, and therefore you'd be able to, it will be the way of communicating to the broadest possible audience that were educated at the university level. But of course, afterward, he said, desiring to communicate what could bear fruit for our French nation, I've also translated it into our tongue. Not because the scholars in France were no good at Latin, but because everybody else in France and everywhere else in the world had no Latin, and therefore he realised the institutes, if they was to reach everybody else, men and women in the pews of the churches throughout the French-speaking world, it had to be translated into French, which means that that's what he had in mind as well. This is not just the sort of thing that your minister should be reading, in other words, it's what you should be reading, Calvin says. And he says so explicitly. I can promise, he says, that it can be a key to open a way for all children of God into a good and right understanding of Holy Scripture. Of course, even at this point, you can imagine some of our students wondering whether they're really up to the task. Of course you are, says Calvin. The idea, quote, is to help simple folk, he says, to lend a hand in order to guide them and help them to find the sum of what God meant to teach us in his word, end of quote. Notice what Calvin has in mind. He thinks that the institutes of the Christian religion are for everybody. This is what we all ought to be aspiring to. He would even say those who've struggled with reading and so on elsewhere ought to have a crack at it. Everyone. As he put it, slightly patronisingly, but in an understandable way, simple folk. Ordinary people. And of course in Reformation Europe there are many simple folk, quote unquote, who had not had much formal education at all, but could just about read, perhaps. Or maybe they'd have to teach themselves to read, as many did in England during the Reformation, so that they could read the scriptures for themselves. And then, of course, they'd be able to read Calvin's Institutes for themselves as well. So in a sense, it's an encouragement. Calvin has not written this in order to make theological issues complicated. He's written it to make them accessible. But of course, it's a challenge at the same time, isn't it? Will we lay down whatever we need to lay down in order to take up these 1,400 pages and work our way through them? And I can tell you that the young people I was talking with on Monday certainly had made a fantastic start on that. Well done to you guys. And we're going to be making our way, Lord willing, through this work in the coming couple of years. And of course, all the resources, if you want to have a look at them, will be available. And so if you feel like you want to dip in yourself, then please feel free just to let me know, and I'll happily send them your way. For now, the Lord bless you, and I hope very much to see you soon. Bye for now.